J-Dubb here.
He said the thing! Oh my god, he said the thing!
So maybe you grew up in a region of this planet where Santa Claus has been a part of your Christmas experience your entire life. Or maybe you didn't, but I'm sure you're still familiar with the guy. As familiar and iconic as the Jolly Rotund guy and all his reindeer are, how much do you know about the actual guy who Santa Claus is based off of? I mean, I'm sure we've all heard stories about St. Nicholas, but most of the times the depictions we're given aren't even placed in the right time and place. And how did he end up becoming the guy with the reindeer? Typically when we think of St. Nicholas, we think of a guy in clerical robes and, you know, the big pointy hat called a bishop's mitre. Well, the actual St. Nicholas wouldn't have worn any of these things. No pointy bishop's mitre and no clerical robes, because in his time, in the 4th century CE, these things didn't exist yet. In fact, when Nicholas started his career, Christianity was still highly illegal, so, you know, you wouldn't have wanted to go walking down the street in an outfit that says, "Look at me, I'm a Christian bishop." Nicholas would have looked like just a regular Greek guy living in Myra in what is now Turkey. Also, you can get an idea of what the actual St. Nicholas looked like because in recent years, the Basilica of St. Nicholas actually allowed researchers to look inside the crypt and take 3D images of his remains, and they used those 3D images to reconstruct his face. So Nicholas was a bishop of the 4th century. What this means is that in early Christianity, before there was a Catholic church or an Eastern Orthodox church or a Greek Orthodox church, basically different regions were considered a church. So there was a Church of Alexandria, a Church of Corinth, a Church of Rome, etc., etc. Each of these regions, each of these regional churches had a leader called a bishop. At this time, bishops and priests were just kind of ordinary citizens. They dressed like everybody else, they got married, they had kids. Nicholas was born in Greece. It's said that he was born to a wealthy family and gave up all his wealth, then came to Myra in what is now Turkey and became a bishop there. As I mentioned, in the beginning of his career, Christianity was still highly illegal, and Nicholas was actually imprisoned for a while. Eventually, Emperor Constantine took over, and in 313 he enacted what's called the Edict of Milan, which basically made all religions legal. Basically, Christians were pardoned. That's when Nicholas was released from prison. Another fact about St. Nicholas is that he was actually present for the Council of Nicaea. One rumor is that during the council at one point, St. Nicholas actually got so impassioned that he punched Arius. Santa Claus came to the Council of Nicaea and punched Arius. That's about what we know about the historical St. Nicholas today. He died around 373 at the age of 73, and it was established that December 6th would be the feast day of St. Nicholas. Also, it was sometime during the 9th century that bishops started wearing their clerical robes and mitres, and saints, early saints such as St. Nicholas, would have started to be depicted in clerical vestments. Sometime around 1087, his bones were taken from Myra to Bari, Italy, where they were entombed there, and they built the Basilica of St. Nicholas. So there are several legends of St. Nicholas's deeds, some of which you've probably heard. Probably the most famous legend involves a father with 3 daughters. They were a poor family, and the father couldn't afford dowries for these 3 daughters. Basically, in order to marry off your daughter, you had to pay the family of the groom. The only option for them to survive is to sell them into slavery. Young St. Nicholas, the story takes place before he became a bishop, felt sorry for this family. He didn't want these girls to be sold into slavery, so At night, he snuck up to the house and secretly threw some gold through the window, which the father found and was able to afford a dowry to marry off the oldest daughter. Later tellings of the story have him tossing the gold down the chimney, but in this time and place, chimneys didn't exist yet. Another night, Nicholas came by the house in secret again and threw some more gold through the window, and the second daughter was able to be married off. And then the next night, he came by to do the same thing, but this time the father had kind of caught on to what was going on, so he stayed awake and caught Nicholas in the act of it. You know, he came out to thank him profusely for saving his daughters from slavery. Nicholas told him, think nothing of it, but then also instructed him, tell no one of this, which apparently he did tell people because we all know the story. There's another story, and this is why St. Nicholas became the patron saint of children, and why St. Nicholas and Santa to this day is connected to children. And it's pretty gruesome. It's not the sort of thing that you expect for a Christmas. It doesn't feel very Christmassy. It's basically like being used to the Disney version of a fairy tale and then hearing the Grimm's Brothers version. Basically, the story goes there was a famine, and a butcher who couldn't afford meat kidnapped 3 boys, slaughtered them, and pickled them to sell as pork. And so St. Nicholas came along, resurrected the 3 boys, and helped them to escape. And that's why he's the patron saint of children. Makes me wonder if they were pickled. Were they still pickled when they were brought back to life? Were there these 3 pickled boys running around? One aspect that didn't quite make it into the Santa Claus tradition is that St. Nicholas is also the patron saint of sailors. And the way that story goes is that St. Nicholas was on a ship to the Holy Land, and there was a big squall that was going to destroy them, and Nicholas spoke into the squall and calmed everything. A lot of sailors will look to St. Nicholas for blessings on December 6th. During the 12th century, nuns in Belgium and France began the practice in honor of the dowry story of leaving gifts at the doorsteps of poor and needy children, basically leaving candy, fruits, nuts. The tradition carried on, and it spread and it grew until it became tradition for parents to leave gifts for their children. Throughout the 16th century, St. Nicholas Day started becoming more commercialized as stores and bakeries started selling, pastries and figurines in honor of St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas Day is connected to Christmas through the celebration of Advent. Advent is a celebration which begins on late November to early December, and it's a celebration of preparing for the coming of Christ. St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, falls during the Advent, and St. Nicholas is considered an Advent saint. Also, Christmas is classically associated with gift giving as well, in homage to the gifts that the Magi, also known as the 3 wise men, brought to the Christ child. So the two holidays kind of have that commonality of being associated with gift giving. St. Nicholas Day celebrations continued in the Netherlands. Here the Dutch pronunciation for Saint Nicholas, Sint-Nicolaas, eventually became shortened to Sinterklaas. Sinterklaas is depicted as an old man with a white beard, wearing a red bishop's mitre and a red cape over robes, sometimes white, sometimes the robes are red as well, and he carries a golden crosier or shepherd's hook. On the evening of December 5th, he's said to ride his horse onto people's rooftops, where he drops presents down through their chimneys. So how did this man become Santa Claus? In the early 17th century, the Dutch East India Company established the trade colony New Netherlands in North America. In 1624, Dutch families began to settle in New Netherlands, taking their sinterklaas celebrations with them. Then in 1665, New Netherlands was seized by the English and New Amsterdam became New York City. St. Nicholas celebrations were relatively unknown to the English. Puritan-led colonies forbade celebrations such as St. Nicholas Day and Christmas, seeing them as unbiblical and pagan. In 1773, a New York newspaper, Rivington's Gazetteer, reported on these Dutch traditions, referring to Sinterklaas as Saint A Claus. Washington Irving, author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, was an avid New Yorker, and in 1809 he published a satirical piece called The History of New York. In this article, he depicts St. Nicholas riding over the trees in a sled. He smokes a pipe and instructs the Dutch settlers on where to build their city of New Amsterdam. Apparently Irvin was really into St. Nicholas and even helped found the St. Nicholas Society of New York, and apparently his works helped spread the popularity of St. Nicholas around the U.S. In 1821, William Gilly published a poem with illustrations called Old Santa Claus with Much Delight. In the illustrations, Santa Claus is depicted wearing what seem to be red furry robes and, rather than a bishop's mitre, a tall fur hat. His flying sled is depicted being pulled by a reindeer. The poem also depicts his arrival on Christmas Eve rather than December the 5th or 6th. A couple years later, in 1823, Clark Clement Moore wrote the famous poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, or more famously known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. This story gained popularity and became the basic template for the modern Santa. St. Nicholas is depicted clad in fur from head to toe. Also, he's described as being portly and round, which Moore claims that he was inspired, his depiction of St. Nicholas was inspired by a Dutch handyman. St. Nicholas is depicted with 8 reindeer, all with their modern names, and he is also depicted as sliding down the chimney himself to enter the house and deliver presents. The first written piece to depict Santa Claus in a workshop full of helper elves in 1855 was called Christmas Elves, written by Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women. This story, however, wasn't published, and a couple of years later, Harper's Weekly magazine published a story about helper elves making toys in Santa's workshop. In the 1860s, political cartoonist Thomas Nast really galvanized the image as well as the popularity of Santa within the United States. He began during the U.S. Civil War with cartoons depicting a Star-Spangled Santa visiting Union troops. After the Civil War, he continued using images of Santa for satirical depictions. However, these images went beyond political satire, popularizing the image of Santa within the traditions of American households. As well, he was also the first person to depict Santa's workshop as being in the North Pole. In the 20th century, after the American Industrial Revolution, retailers had a heyday with Christmas as an opportunity to promote Christmas sales and propagated the image of Santa. In the 1930s, artist Haddon Sundblom pretty well finalized the iconic image of Santa for a series of Coca-Cola ads. In 1939, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was added to Santa's sleigh in a children's book handed out for free to shoppers by Montgomery Ward. And in the 60s, a series of stop-motion animations were created featuring Santa, Mrs. Claus, Rudolph, and the elves. And that's how you went from a Greek man of the 4th century to a European red-clad bishop on a white horse to a portly man riding in a flying sleigh led by reindeer. And the rest is history. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time. J-Dubb out.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to see a video on the history of Looney Tunes, go ahead and click on the video on the left. And if you were curious why people were cheering when I said J-Dubb here at the beginning of this video, go ahead and click on the video on the right to see my previous video. And if you like this content, go ahead and subscribe.